They never raised their voices. That's the first thing people misunderstand about a paperwork war. They imagine shouting, threats, maybe a dramatic confrontation on a lawn or in a courtroom. None of that happened. What happened was quieter, cleaner, more deliberate. It began with a letter that didn't accuse me of anything. It didn't demand, it didn't fine, it didn't even warn, it simply arrived. Thin, polite, folded once, as if it were doing me a favor by existing. It thanked me. That's how power works now. It thanks you while it takes pieces of your life apart. If you've ever felt pressure without fingerprints, coercion without force, or fear without a single illegal word on the page, stay with this. And if this story sounds uncomfortably familiar, subscribe. You'll want what comes next. The letter called itself a courtesy notice. That phrase is important. Courtesy suggests goodwill. It suggests that what follows is optional, temporary, friendly. But courtesy notices are not written for you. They're written for records, for files, for later. During a routine community review, it said, a minor inconsistency was observed. Observed, passive voice, no name, no date. No human being attached to the claim, just a fact that now existed simply because it had been written down. There was no deadline, no penalty, no consequence stated. Just a request that I review the matter at my earliest convenience. That's how the war recruits you, by making you believe you're participating voluntarily. I didn't panic. I didn't argue. I didn't even feel angry. I did what reasonable people do when faced with something vague and official. I complied. I fixed what I thought they meant. I took photos. I emailed them back, polite, concise, cooperative. That response was logged somewhere. I didn't know it at the time, but that was the moment I entered the system. The next letter came 3 weeks later. Same tone, same format, same softness, but this one referenced the first. It used language like follow-up and continuing compliance. Words that assume a process is already underway. Words that quietly erase your ability to step back. This time there was a date, still no fine, still no threat. Just a sentence at the bottom that read, please be advised that unresolved matters may be subject to further review. Maybe, not will, maybe, that single phrase changed everything, because now the issue wasn't what they wanted fixed. The issue was uncertainty. I didn't know what further review meant. I didn't know who decided when something was unresolved. I didn't know how many steps existed between courtesy and catastrophe. That's the architecture of a paperwork war. It's not built to punish you immediately. It's built to keep you suspended. You start checking your mailbox differently. You open envelopes slower. You reread sentences looking for hidden meanings. You begin keeping copies, then folders, then timelines. Your home stops feeling like shelter. It becomes evidence. I called the number on the letter. A voicemail picked up. I left a message. Calm, respectful, cooperative, no one called back. That silence wasn't accidental. Silence is leverage. The third letter arrived certified. That's when your body reacts before your brain does. Certified mail triggers something primitive. It bypasses logic and goes straight to survival. Someone wants proof you received this. Someone is preparing for a future version of you who might deny it. This letter didn't introduce anything new. That was the cruel part. It repeated the concern. It referenced the previous communications. And then it added one new phrase. This matter is now considered ongoing. Ongoing? Another word that sounds neutral and isn't. An ongoing matter doesn't expire on its own. It doesn't resolve by accident. It requires action, but the action is never clearly defined. You are expected to guess correctly. I started documenting everything. Dates, times, photos, emails, receipts. I thought that was smart. I thought documentation would protect me. I didn't understand yet that documentation is also how they measure compliance fatigue. Because a paperwork war isn't about winning an argument. It's about endurance. It's about how long you can keep responding before you miss something small enough to be fatal. The next notice introduced a committee. No names, just the committee. That's when the power dynamics fully revealed themselves. Committees don't feel accountable. They feel institutional. You can't reason with a committee. You can't read its tone. You can't appeal to its empathy. A committee doesn't get tired. You do. They requested additional clarification. Then additional documentation. Then a different format. Then resubmission due to incomplete information. Every response reset the clock. Every submission became another opportunity to find fault, not with the issue, but with how I responded. At no point did anyone say I was non-compliant. At no point did anyone say I was in violation. But everything they wrote assumed the possibility that I could be. That's the psychological chokehold. You are never accused, but you are never cleared. Friends told me I was overreacting. It's just paperwork, they said. It's routine. That's because people only recognize danger when it's loud. This was quiet, administrative, smiling. What they didn't see was the time drain, the emotional taxation, the way every letter forced me to drop everything and re-enter a defensive posture. The way my life began orbiting around mail delivery schedules. The war escalates not by force, but by volume, more letters, more references, more internal codes, more phrases like pursuant to, as previously noted, per established procedure. You start to feel small. Not because you've done something wrong, but because you're constantly being addressed. That's when I realized something crucial. This wasn't about compliance. If it were, it would have ended. This was about dominance. About establishing who controls the narrative, the timeline, and the outcome. Paperwork wars don't aim to defeat you immediately. They aim to reposition you, from homeowner to respondent, from resident to subject. And once that shift happens, everything you do is interpreted through suspicion. The scariest part isn't the threat of fines or legal action, it's the slow erosion of certainty, the loss of solid ground. The feeling that your own home is no longer neutral territory. By the end of that first phase, nothing catastrophic had happened yet, which is exactly the point. The real damage doesn't come from the blow. It comes from waiting for it, while proving over and over that you don't deserve it. And that's how the paperwork war truly begins. By the time the fourth letter arrived, I had stopped reacting to the envelope itself. That's another shift people don't notice. At first, the paper scares you, then the paper becomes normal. What starts to hurt is the anticipation. You learn the rhythm, you learn how often they write. You learn that silence doesn't mean resolution, it means preparation. This letter was longer, not aggressive, just dense. Dense is how power hides its intentions. It referenced policies I had never seen. Sections, subsections. Internal numbering systems that meant nothing to me and everything to them. It didn't explain those rules. It simply assumed their authority. Assumption is the quietest form of domination. They asked for a response within 10 days. Still no fine, still no threat, but now there was a clock. I noticed something else too. The language had shifted from request to expectation. Subtle, almost elegant, but expectations create obligation without admitting it. If you fail to meet an expectation, you look unreasonable, even if the expectation was never fair. I responded on day 3, not because I needed that much time, but because I wanted to demonstrate good faith. That instinct, I would later understand, was a mistake. In a paperwork war, speed is interpreted as vulnerability. It tells them you are watching. It tells them you are anxious to please. The reply came back in 6 days. That delay was intentional. Institutions delay not because they're busy, but because time itself is a pressure tool. While you wait, you imagine outcomes, you replay your wording, you second-guess tone. They do nothing and still advance the conflict. Their response thanked me for my cooperation. That word again. Then it stated that my submission had been reviewed and that additional clarification was required. No explanation as to why. No acknowledgement of what I had already provided. Just a new list. This is where the war changes shape. You realize you're no longer addressing an issue, you're responding to a process designed to never feel complete. Each answer creates the need for another question. Each clarification opens a new ambiguity. I began keeping a spreadsheet, dates, reference numbers, subject lines, who said what, and more importantly, what was never said. Silence became its own category. That's when the phone calls started, not to me, to third parties. A neighbor casually mentioned that the association had been asking questions. Another hinted that there were concerns, no specifics. No accusations, just the suggestion that something about me was under review. Paperwork wars expand outward, they recruit the environment. Now it wasn't just letters, it was looks, pauses in conversation. A slight change in tone when people spoke to me. Social pressure does what paperwork can't, it isolates. The next notice included the phrase potential escalation. Still conditional, still vague. But the word escalation is chosen carefully. It triggers images without providing facts. You fill in the blanks yourself. They attached a form. Forms are the skeleton key of bureaucratic power. Once you sign one, you're no longer just responding, you're affirming their framework. You're acknowledging their jurisdiction. You're participating in your own containment. The form asked questions I couldn't answer cleanly. Yes or no boxes for situations that were neither. Declarations that required certainty where none existed. Spaces too small for context. Too small for truth. I hesitated. That hesitation cost me. Another letter followed, this one noting that the form had not yet been returned. not accusatory, just observational, but it reframed my hesitation as non-responsiveness. That's when the language hardened, not overtly, but structurally. Sentences grew longer, paragraphs stacked, references multiplied. The warmth drained out, not replaced by hostility but by procedure. Procedure doesn't care how reasonable you are, it only cares whether you fit. I submitted the form. I added an attachment to explain the answers. That explanation would later be described as extraneous. Extraneous, another harmless-sounding word, what it really means is unwelcome. You're allowed to speak, but only within their margins. The response came with a new designation, file. My name had become a file. Files don't have circumstances, they have histories, and histories can always be reframed. The next communication informed me that my matter had been referred for internal review. This is where people think legal action begins. It doesn't. Internal review is worse. Internal review has no rules you can see, no timeline you can track, no standard of fairness you can appeal to. It exists entirely outside your influence, and yet you are still required to respond. They requested documents from years prior. Photos, records, proof of intent. Proof of effort, proof that I had always been compliant. That's when the imbalance fully revealed itself. They had institutional memory. I had my own fallible recollection. They could demand evidence indefinitely. I could only provide what still existed. This is how paperwork becomes a weapon, not by falsifying facts, but by exploiting time. Every missing document becomes suspicion. Every gap becomes a narrative opportunity for them. I started losing sleep, not because I was afraid of fines, but because I couldn't predict the next move. Unpredictability is destabilization by design, and yet nothing illegal had occurred. That's the brilliance of it. Everything they did was technically allowed, properly formatted, carefully worded, reviewed. A paperwork war doesn't break laws, it bends lives. By the end of this phase, I wasn't asking how to resolve the issue anymore. I was asking how long I could keep going, because that's the real question they want you to face. Not are you right, but are you tired yet? And the answer to that question determines who survives the war. The moment the word legal appears, everything changes, even if nothing actually changes. It didn't arrive as a threat, it arrived as a reference. Buried in the middle of a paragraph, surrounded by procedural language, the phrase appeared. As advised by legal counsel. No names, no firm, no letterhead, just the implication that someone somewhere had translated my existence into risk. That single phrase repositions you instantly. You are no longer dealing with administrators. You are dealing with a structure that has already imagined you in conflict. The letter didn't accuse me of violating anything. It didn't demand payment. It didn't even state consequences. But the presence of legal counsel transformed every sentence that followed into something heavier. Words that once felt bureaucratic now felt strategic. They requested a timeline, not a simple one, a comprehensive one. They wanted dates, descriptions, actions taken, responses given. They wanted the story of the conflict, but framed according to their categories, their sequence, their logic. That's another turning point in a paperwork war. When they ask you to narrate yourself, because narration creates admissions. Even when you tell the truth, you are still choosing what to include and what to omit. And omissions, intentional or not, become leverage later. I drafted the timeline 3 times. The first version was factual, clean, minimal, it read like a report. The second version added context. The third added explanations. I deleted the third. Explanations are seen as defenses. Defenses imply guilt. I sent the second. 2 weeks passed, no response. This silence felt different, heavier, purposeful. Silence after legal language isn't neutral, it's incubation. During that time, I received a separate notice. Different subject line, different reference number, same sender, this one introduced fees. Not fines, fees, administrative processing fees, review fees, documentation fees, modest individually, cumulative by design. The letter framed them as standard, routine, unavoidable. It made no connection to the ongoing matter, but it referenced it indirectly. Everything now referenced everything else. This is how they monetize pressure. Fees don't feel punitive, they feel transactional, reasonable. You pay them because you don't want to appear difficult. You pay them because they're not technically penalties. You pay them because refusing would escalate things you're still trying to contain. I paid. That payment was logged. Payment is another form of participation. Once money changes hands, the relationship shifts. You are no longer just responding, you are funding the mechanism that's targeting you. The next letter acknowledged receipt of the fees. Then it stated that the internal review had identified areas of concern, plural, still unnamed, still undefined, but now officially recognized. They offered an opportunity to address these concerns voluntarily. Voluntary is one of the most deceptive words in bureaucratic language. It suggests choice without providing alternatives. Along with that opportunity came another form. This one required attestations, statements signed under acknowledgement, not under penalty of perjury, but close enough to trigger the same fear response. The language was careful. They didn't say false statements would be punished. They said inaccurate statements could impact future determinations. Impact, determinations, future, everything was future-facing now. Everything was about what might happen. I noticed how often the word may appeared. May be subject, may result in, may require, may keeps you suspended. It never resolves. I consulted an attorney. That consultation didn't bring relief. It brought clarity, and clarity is heavier. The attorney didn't say I was wrong. They didn't say I was right. They said I was exposed to process. They explained something most people don't realize until it's too late. In paperwork wars, the outcome often matters less than the record. Institutions don't need to defeat you outright. They need to document that they could have. That documentation protects them, exhausts you. The attorney advised restraint. Precision, minimal responses. No emotion, no excess. That advice felt unnatural. Everything in me wanted to explain, to resolve, to close the loop. But loops in paperwork wars are traps. They don't close, they tighten. I returned the attestation form. I left one section blank, not because I was hiding anything, but because the question itself assumed a conclusion I couldn't agree with. Leaving it blank was the only honest option. The response came quickly this time. They noted the omission, not angrily, just clinically. They requested completion within 5 days. The clock again. This time, the letter included a sentence that made my stomach drop. Failure to provide complete information may be interpreted as non-cooperation. Interpreted by whom? Under what standard? Based on what authority? None of that mattered. The sentence existed, and once written, it became real. I filled in the section. I hated that I did. That's another cost of the war. You compromise not on facts, but on comfort, on your own sense of agency. You begin choosing the path of least resistance, even when it doesn't feel right. That choice doesn't end the pressure, it feeds it. The next notice informed me that the matter would remain open pending final assessment. Open, that word again. Nothing ends, everything lingers. At this stage, the war had accomplished its primary goal. I was no longer thinking about fairness. I was thinking about survival, about minimizing exposure, about avoiding escalation, about staying invisible. That's the transformation they engineer, from homeowner to risk manager, from resident to liability. And once that transformation is complete, they don't need to push harder. You do the work for them. Because now, every envelope isn't just paper. It's a reminder that your life is being audited, slowly, quietly, and entirely on their terms. There is a moment in every paperwork war when you realize the conflict no longer needs momentum. It has inertia. By the time the next notice arrived, nothing new was happening, yet everything felt heavier. That's how sustained pressure works. It doesn't escalate in volume, it deepens in weight. This letter didn't introduce new concerns. It didn't request new documents, it simply reclassified the situation. What had once been an ongoing matter was now labeled a compliance posture. Posture implies stance, intent. It suggests that you are choosing a position, even when you are only reacting. This is how institutions assign motive without stating it outright. The letter explained that my compliance posture would be evaluated periodically. Periodically, no schedule, no criteria, no endpoint, just the knowledge that at any moment someone could decide whether my posture was acceptable. That's when I stopped feeling like a person interacting with a system. I felt like an object being measured. Around this time, small things began to change in my daily behavior. I stopped making improvements to my home, not because I didn't want to, but because every change felt like a new variable that could be misinterpreted. I delayed harmless decisions. I avoided attention. This is one of the least discussed impacts of paperwork harassment, self-restriction. You begin shrinking your life to reduce exposure. No one told me to do that. No rule required it. But the environment trained me. The next communication came via email instead of mail. That shift mattered. Email feels faster, less formal, but it also feels omnipresent. You can't leave it unopened on a counter. It follows you. It interrupts. The email referenced a pattern. That word stopped me cold. Patterns are powerful because they turn isolated events into narratives. Once a pattern is asserted, individual explanations stop mattering. You are no longer addressing facts, you are addressing character. The email didn't define the pattern. It didn't list examples. It simply stated that the committee had observed a pattern of delayed responsiveness. Delayed compared to what? I had met every stated deadline, but deadlines aren't the only measure. Expectations exist outside the calendar. This is where compliance quietly mutates into performance. You're no longer just responding. You're being evaluated on tone, timing, and perceived attitude. I responded immediately. That response, ironically, would later be cited as reactive. You can't win a metric you don't control. The next step was a corrective pathway. The word pathway sounds helpful. It implies guidance, direction, support. The document attached outlined steps, each step contingent on successful completion of the previous one. Each step subject to review, each review conducted by the same unnamed body. Corrective pathways are not designed for correction. They are designed for documentation. Every step you complete becomes proof that steps were required in the first place. You are retroactively consenting to the premise that something was wrong. I hesitated again. That hesitation triggered another notice, this one labeled reminder. Reminders are not neutral. They exist to establish that you were told, that you were aware, that future consequences will be framed as your choice. This time, the language included a phrase I hadn't seen before: administrative discretion. Discretion is the softest word for power. It signals that outcomes depend not on rules, but on judgment. And judgment cannot be appealed easily, because it is, by definition, subjective. I completed the first step. It required a written statement, not a defense, not an explanation. A reflection is a trap. It asks you to internalize their framing, to demonstrate insight into your own supposed shortcomings, to participate emotionally in a process that is not emotional at all. I wrote carefully, neutrally. I acknowledged the process without conceding fault. The response thanked me, then it requested revisions. They wanted it more aligned. Aligned with what? They didn't say. I rewrote it. That rewrite became part of my file. That's another invisible cost. Every version of you that you submit remains, even when you correct it, even when you refine it. All versions coexist in the archive. They moved me to the second step. This one involved verification. Verification of compliance actions already taken. Verification of communications already sent. Verification of intent. Intent cannot be verified, but they asked anyway. I complied. At this stage, the war no longer felt adversarial. It felt administrative, which is far worse, because adversaries recognize conflict. Administrators normalize it. Friends stopped asking how it was going. There was nothing to report. No explosions, no court dates, just ongoing pressure. It's hard to explain to someone that your life is being slowly narrowed by forms, and that's how isolation deepens, not through drama, but through monotony. The final communication of this phase informed me that my corrective pathway was under observation. Not completed, not rejected, under observation. Observation implies surveillance. You are being watched, not for what you do wrong, but for whether you relax too soon. That's the brilliance of it. You never know when you're allowed to exhale. By now, the war had taken something from me that I hadn't realized was vulnerable. Confidence, not in my innocence, but in my stability. I had done everything asked, provided everything requested, paid everything assessed, and still the matter remained open. That's when it became clear. This was no longer about correcting behavior. It was about reshaping it, about teaching me how to exist under authority. And the lesson was simple: stay small, stay alert, stay responsive. Because the paperwork war doesn't need to end to succeed. It only needs to change how you live. The strangest phase of a paperwork war is the one where nothing appears to be happening. No new letters, no emails, no reminders. No deadlines, just quiet. To anyone outside it, that quiet would look like resolution. To anyone inside it, quiet is the most dangerous condition of all, because silence in this system doesn't mean the process has stopped. It means it has moved somewhere you can't see. I waited, a week. Then, too, I checked my inbox compulsively. I refreshed folders. I listened for the sound of mail hitting the box outside. Every day without communication made me feel less safe, not more. That's the paradox. You become conditioned to pressure. When it disappears, you assume something worse is forming. Eventually, an email arrived. No subject line urgency. No attachments, just a short message stating that my file was being held pending determination. Held, that word carries weight. It implies custody, control. It means the file is no longer active, but it is not closed. It exists in limbo where time does not protect you. I asked what determination meant. The response came 2 days later. Brief, polite, impersonal. Determination refers to the committee's assessment of whether additional action is warranted. Warranted by what standard? They didn't say. This is where most people make a critical mistake. They assume the next step will be obvious, that escalation will announce itself clearly, that there will be a warning before consequences. There isn't. Instead, new variables begin to appear unrelated on the surface, but connected underneath. I received notice of a routine inspection. Routine is another word that sounds harmless until it isn't. Routine inspections are scheduled to appear neutral, but in a paperwork war, nothing is neutral anymore. Everything feeds the file. The inspection found nothing significant. That should have mattered. It didn't. The report noted general compliance, but also included language about opportunities for continued alignment. Alignment again. That word kept returning like a drumbeat. Alignment implies conformity, not to rules but to expectations. Expectations that are never fully written. Another fee appeared. This one wasn't tied to a violation. It was tied to oversight. Oversight costs money, apparently. And because the matter was still pending, oversight continued. I paid again, not because I agreed, but because refusing would have reframed me as resistant. Resistance in these systems is treated as evidence. I realized something unsettling around this time. I was budgeting not just money, but attention. I planned my weeks around potential correspondence. I avoided travel in case I needed to respond quickly. I stayed reachable. Available on edge. This is the hidden extraction of paperwork wars. They don't just take resources, they take bandwidth. The next communication referenced my history, not the facts, my history. They summarized prior steps, responses, revisions, delays, payments. Everything was technically accurate, but the tone was different. Where earlier letters had been neutral, this one felt evaluative. The past had been assembled into a story. That's when I understood the real danger. Once your history exists as a narrative they control, your present actions lose power. Everything you do is interpreted through what has already been written. I responded carefully, too carefully. That response was later described as overly detailed. Detail becomes a liability when someone else controls interpretation. What you see as clarity, they see as complication. Another silence followed, then another inspection notice. Then another email reminding me that the matter remained open. Open matters attract gravity. They pull unrelated events into their orbit. A neighbor complaint was logged, anonymous, vague, unverifiable, but it went into the file. Files don't care about truth, they care about inclusion. I requested a copy of my file. That request took 3 weeks to process. When it arrived, it wasn't complete. Sections were summarized instead of reproduced. Internal communications were omitted, deliberations were excluded. What I received wasn't my file. It was a version of me they were willing to show. That's another rule of paperwork wars. Transparency is always partial. You are allowed to see enough to comply, but never enough to challenge the structure itself. At this stage, the system no longer needed new actions from me. It had what it wanted: a record of engagement, a record of responsiveness, a record of payment, a record of hesitation, a record of alignment attempts. Whether the issue ever resolved was secondary. Because now, if something happened in the future, anything at all, this file would be waiting, ready to contextualize, ready to justify, ready to explain why scrutiny was reasonable. That's when the exhaustion set in, not the dramatic kind, but the deep administrative fatigue that makes you question whether fighting is worth it. You start thinking in trade-offs. If I comply, maybe it ends. If I push back, maybe it escalates. If I do nothing, maybe it fades. These systems are designed so every option carries risk. And then came the letter that didn't look important at all. A small update, almost casual. It stated that no further action was required at this time. At this time, those 3 words negate everything that comes before them. No closure. No clearance, no acknowledgement of completion, just a pause framed as mercy. I should have felt relief. I didn't. Because by then, I understood the final truth of paperwork wars. They don't end with resolution. They end with conditioning. You learn what attracts attention. You learn what silence costs. You learn how quickly normal life can be pulled into review. And once you've learned those lessons, the system doesn't need to touch you again. You will regulate yourself. You will hesitate before acting. You will remember how easily paper can become pressure. And that memory will do the work long after the letters stop coming. There is no closing letter in a paperwork war, no declaration of peace. No acknowledgement that what was done to you was excessive, unnecessary, or harmful. The system does not apologize because apology would imply responsibility, and responsibility is the one thing it is engineered to avoid. What you get instead is distance. Time passes, weeks turn into months, the file stops being referenced, emails stop arriving, inspections return to being routine again. On the surface, life resumes, but something fundamental has shifted. The war does not end when the paperwork stops. It ends when you stop expecting safety. That realization came slowly. At first, I noticed it in small choices. I delayed decisions that once felt trivial. I reread communications before sending them, any communication, not just official ones. I became precise in ways that had nothing to do with compliance and everything to do with fear of misinterpretation. This is the final phase of bureaucratic harassment, internalization. You don't need to be watched anymore, you watch yourself. What the system ultimately achieves isn't enforcement, it's behavioral modification. You become quieter. Less visible, less willing to challenge, not because you've been defeated, but because you've been trained. That training doesn't rely on trauma, it relies on uncertainty. You never learn exactly what crossed the line. You only learn that lines exist and that finding them accidentally is costly. That ambiguity is intentional. Clear rules can be navigated. Vague standards create obedience. I realized something else too, looking back over the records I had kept. At no point had anyone proven I was wrong. At no point had anyone stated I was right. That balance is not accidental. Declaring you wrong invites defense. Declaring you right closes the file. The system survives in the space between. Neutrality is not fairness. Neutrality is leverage. This is the truth most people never see unless they live it. Paperwork wars are not about resolving issues. They are about establishing precedent, quietly, incrementally, without resistance. Once a precedent exists, it doesn't matter whether it's used again. Its existence alone changes behavior. And it's not just homeowners, it's tenants. Professionals, patients, employees, anyone who exists inside a structure that communicates through forms instead of voices. Paperwork wars are the preferred weapon of modern power because they look like order. Order feels safe. Order feels reasonable. Order feels justified. But order without accountability is just control wearing a clean uniform. The hardest part to accept was this: there was no villain to confront, no single person to blame. No malicious mastermind, just a system doing what systems do, optimizing for itself. That makes it harder to explain to others. When you try, it sounds paranoid, exaggerated, abstract. People want stories with villains. They struggle with stories about structures, so most victims stay quiet. Silence benefits the system more than compliance ever could, because silence prevents patterns from being recognized. It keeps experiences isolated. It makes each person feel alone, like they're the only one struggling with something so invisible. That isolation is the final reinforcement. If you take anything from this story, let it be this: paperwork is not neutral. Forms are not harmless. Processes are not objective just because they are standardized. Whenever power insists on endless documentation without clear resolution, it is not seeking truth. It is testing endurance. And endurance is not infinite. Survival in a paperwork war does not mean winning. It means recognizing the terrain early. It means understanding that clarity is protection and vagueness is danger. It means documenting not just what you submit, but how the system responds. It means knowing when cooperation becomes self-erasure. And most of all, it means refusing to internalize guilt for a process designed to never declare innocence. Because the moment you accept that burden, the war has already achieved its goal. The paperwork may stop, the file may rest, but the real victory for them only comes if you forget what happened, if you normalize it. If you tell yourself it was nothing, it wasn't nothing. It was a lesson in how quietly power can operate when it doesn't need force. And once you've seen that, truly seen it, you can never unsee it. That awareness is the only real defense. Not compliance, not silence, awareness.